This is Western Mass News on Fox 6.
Former President Donald Trump is facing federal charges in connection with his alleged mishandling of classified documents. Welcome to Western Mass News at 10 on Fox 6. I'm Amanda Callahan. The Department of Justice releasing now his second indictment earlier today. Western Mass News reporter Maria Wilson joins us in studio after getting answers from a criminal defense attorney. Maria.
Amanda, federal prosecutors allege the former president is storing documents containing national secrets in his Florida home and even showing others on 2 occasions.
Our laws that protect national defense information are critical for the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced.
The Justice Department unsealing a federal indictment on Friday, which charges former President Donald Trump with 37 felony counts of mishandling classified documents. The 49-page document painting a picture of how the former president allegedly took classified documents to his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, and shared sensitive information with others after leaving the White House, marking the first time a former president has faced federal charges. Federal prosecutors say Trump stored the documents in boxes which contained information on defense and weapon capabilities of both the U.S. and foreign countries, the U.S. nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities of the United States and its allies to military attacks, and plans for possible retaliation in response to a foreign attack. Trump is facing 31 counts of violating the Espionage Act for his, quote, willful retention of classified records, something criminal defense attorney Jeremy Powers says has both political and legal implications.
There's a political implication and a legal implication. The political implication is what it is, but the legal implication is very serious when you have mandatory minimums, which may be associated with some of the statutes that he's charged under. It's considerably more serious in the indictment he faces out of the state of New York. Anytime a federal indictment is involved, there's more serious penalties. He's also charged under the Espionage Act, which is serious in itself.
Massachusetts Congressman Richard Neal also weighing in on the indictment before it was unsealed Friday afternoon.
I assume that this will be a pretty discerning process, and I think that it's the obligation of the government as they outline the charges to make sure that it's obviously focused on the nature of the charges.
And as Trump has officially launched his bid for the 2024 presidential election, many are wondering how this could alter his campaign. Western New England University history professor John Back says, although the charges are serious, this situation will have little impact.
He could run the country from a jail cell if he is found guilty in New York State, for example, and sent to jail. He could still run for the presidency. The Secret Service would have to provide him protection in jail.
The former president is set to be arraigned in Miami on Tuesday, at which point the judge will consider the conditions of his release. Trump may have to post bail, but Powers tells me that is an unlikely scenario. Reporting in studio, Maria Wilson, Western Mass News.